Hi guys, this is Creative Cuts, a channel where I build, paint and create things. And today's video was directly influenced by you, the audience. In my last video where I built a river scene, I received so many comments asking how I preserve real plants to use in my dioramas. So, ask and you shall receive. And I thought the best way to do this was to build a forest scene using mainly natural materials. But before we begin, if you like these kind of build videos, hit the like button to show your appreciation, subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, as you never know, it might be the topic of the next video. So, as with most of my builds, every project must have a stable base. I cut down a piece of plywood that I had spare. Any solid material will do, but I found that using something that isn't prone to warping really helps prevent problems later down the line. I have a box of XPS foam offcuts from previous projects, and these came in perfect when I need to quickly build up some mass for my terrain. I simply glue these down using some hot glue, as it really allows me to work quickly, because I don't need to wait ages for it to dry. I flesh out some basic shapes, and this will begin to define my composition. Whilst I don't have an exact plan at this stage, I roughly know what I want to include and begin thinking about my composition and where the ideal viewpoint for the viewer will be. Now this may be somewhat obvious to some of you, and may sound like complete gibberish to others. Let me know if you want me to do a video explaining the basics of composition. But for those who do, by thinking about where your model will be viewed from, can allow you to force aspects of the composition to your needs. In this case, I felt my model would be best viewed from the front. So I decided a bit of elevation would allow me to show off more plants and also create more visual interest than just a flat scene. I also know that many of you don't have all the fancy tools that I have, so to shape my foam, rather than using a hot wire cutter, in today's video I've decided to go back to basics and just use a simple sharp knife. I'm not worried about detail at this stage, just simple forms. All that will come later. Next I mix up some sculptor mold and apply this to my model. You can use sculptor mold to great effect to make all kinds of rocks and terrain, but in this project I'm just using it to soften the transition between my foam shapes and join everything together. You can use all kinds of special spreaders for this, but I find the simplest way is to just get your hands dirty and smear it on. For those who don't like dirty hands, some nitrile gloves will come in very handy. And before I move on to the next steps, I always like to seal my sculptor mold with some Mod Podge. This just locks everything in place and stops the plaster and the sculptor mold from being so absorbent. Once dry, I reach for some leftover phlox, moss and bits of stick that I had left over from my last project. I rarely throw anything away, and more often than not will just store leftover materials in these takeaway boxes for future use. For this model, I really wanted to go as natural as possible. So, I added as many natural elements as I possibly could. Modelling doesn't need to be super expensive. Nature provides so many of the materials that you might need and often look far more realistic than shop-bought modelling products. Sure, they might need a little more effort and careful preparation, but once you get into using natural products, you will look at the world around you in a completely different way. I mix up all kinds of foresty looking things. You can make this up any way you want and tailor this to your specific needs, and don't worry so much about specific recipes. Just know that You can mix up most materials and then add some acrylic medium and some glue and water to thin, and you're good to go. In this instance, I had a bit of paint to tint my mixture, but that's up to you. You may also notice that I sprayed my model black in the meantime, and this is purely just to hide any glowing white bits shining through that I may miss when spreading out my mixture. And just glue my ground mixture on. And while it's still wet, I sprinkle on a few stones and bits of dirt, as the glue in the mixture will hold this down. And while I'm waiting for all this to dry, I turn to the main topic of this video, preserving plants. You can preserve nearly any kind of plant or leaf, but one of my favourites is a houseplant called an asparagus fern. You can find these in most garden centres for relatively cheap. I do a bit of pruning, and before long I have a tub full of leaves from various plants I have around the house. Now, the process of preserving plants is really easy. All you need is something you want to preserve, some glycerin and some water. I mix up 1 part glycerin to 2 parts water, and then just pour it over the leaves or plants. Make sure your plants are fully submerged. I do this with some plastic embroidery grid and then weigh it down with a weight. Then just pop the lid on and wait around 48 to 72 hours, and then you're good. Using real plants can be tricky, as most will shrivel up and die after a few days. So preserving them will stop all this from happening and allow you to use real plants in your models. The glycerin basically replaces the water in the stems and stops the decay. Once soaked, you simply take out your plants and leave them to dry on some paper towels, and voila! You have yourself some preserved plants. And to continue my natural theme, I went to the local park and collected some dead sticks and shaped these into points at the top with a knife. Next I took a drill and a small drill bit and drilled holes all around my tree trunks. And whilst I was out on my stick mission, I also collected a bunch of even smaller sticks to use as branches on my tree. After doing this a few times, you will quickly become an expert as to which trees or shrubs provide specific shapes and sizes of material and where to find them. I then just dab the ends of my fine sticks into some superglue and then insert them into the trunk. I leave them longer than I need, as it just makes it a bit easier to work with, and I can always trim them back to get the shape of the tree that I'm after. Once I have all my branches glued in, I grab my airbrush and give my trees a coat of light brown, dark brown, grey and then green. This colour variation helps them look much more realistic and also ties everything together. And while my tree trunks are drying, I turn back to my model and spray it with a bit of IPA. This helps break down the surface tension of my glue and water mix, which I add over the top of this, which allows it to get into all those little nooks and crannies. This not only locks all the little small rocks and pebbles I added earlier, but also allows me to just sprinkle on a further layer of dirt and crushed up leaves. I like to fix my trees to my model with a small nail glued into the base of my tree, and this also allows me to stick the base of my tree into a spare bit of foam, which makes it much more easy to work on. trim the branches to size, and then just add a little bit of super glue to the top side of each branch and carefully lay a section of my preserved fern onto the branch and fix this in place with some activator. You can use tweezers or a long thin stick like I'm using here to help stop getting your fingers covered in super glue, and also carefully position the leaves. I then just work my way around the tree, one branch at a time. Sure, this is a bit of a slow process, and be forewarned that you'll need far more leaves than you might think. But I promise you that all this extra effort will be worth it in the end. As you can see, the preserved asparagus ferns works great to make pine trees, and in my opinion gives you the most realistic pine tree I've seen out there. I then just poke the nail in the tree trunk through my terrain base and attach it with a bit of super glue. I also add a few more tree stumps and also add some roots to the trees. These are just actual dried roots that I've collected over time from walks or from the garden, and then saved up for projects like these. I'm not too worried at this stage if my roots have a different colour to my tree stump, as I can easily paint them later. But for now I'm just trying to create a realistic looking scene and think about how the roots of the tree may grow. I paint in the roots and then begin the process of slowly adding plants and foliage to the scene. This will always feel a bit scary at first, and it will also look awful, but just keep adding different types of plants and think about how they might grow, and before long the magic happens. As I said in many of my previous videos, what I've come to learn from years of model making is that variation is key. Nature is full of different colours and shapes and sizes of plants, and in order to create the illusion of nature in miniature, the same principles apply. But by using real plants and moss, you're already some of the way there, as you already have so much colour and shape variation. You can always change this colour a bit with a light dusting of paint from an airbrush, if needed, but using real plants is a fantastic way to take your dioramas to the next level. The one shop-bought bit of greenery that I use is some static grass tufts in various lengths and colours. I try to use the most natural static grass I can find, because not all grass tufts are equal. You will find many really bad grass tufts out there with really artificial looking colours. But in this case I'm using gamer grass and have found them to make some really quality products. I'll keep adding more and more preserved plants and moss, often using them to create completely new plants. I also use these plants to hide any transition from the roots to the tree trunk that I'm not so happy with. And all the while just thinking about where these plants may naturally grow in real life and adapt that to my scene. Moss is a great space filler, as it can be teased apart for smaller shrubs or clumped together to make small bushes. Next I go around and just add little drops of PVA glue around here and there, and sprinkle on little homemade dead leaves that I made many years ago. To do this I bought the smallest leaf punch I could find, and then tinted some thin paper with tea bags, and then spent an evening stamping out thousands and thousands of small leaves from paper. Sure, that's quite a bit of effort, but for one evening's work I now pretty much have a lifetime supply of dead leaves. I also sprinkle on some dead asparagus fern leaves. Basically nature's answer to static grass, and also sprinkle on more crushed up dried actual leaves. Again, just building up that level of colour variation, texture and detail. To add a further bit of visual interest to my scene, I add a bit of water to make a puddle. To do this, I take a bit of still water diorama effects from Vallejo and just carefully drip it into the natural depression in my terrain that I'd crafted. I also sprinkle in a few more dried leaves and some very fine flock that may have naturally blown into the puddle. And lastly, I add a model bear that I bought from the gift shop at zoo and saved for a project like this, and then just simply glue it into place. And there we are, a super realistic model that even a beginner could build using simple steps and techniques that will take your model making to the next level. If you have enjoyed the video and would like to see more like this, then there's plenty more on the channel to look through, and be sure to subscribe to see more like this in the future. Hit the like button and let me know in the comments below if you've learned something, or if there are specific topics that you would like me to cover in the future. As I've said throughout this video, using preserved plants is a fantastic way to bring an extra level of realism and detail to your models. Working from photos really helps too. But I found that the best source of reference is to actually get out there in nature and see for yourself. Look at how plants grow and discover which plants give great shapes and textures, and while you're out on your next research mission, you can always collect a few modelling materials along the way. Thank you for watching and enjoy.